What happens when one of Britain's most beloved actors sits down for what should be a simple morning chat and ends up walking off set in disgust? In just 34 seconds of brutal questioning, Lorraine Kelly turned a friendly interview into a disaster that nobody saw coming. Colin Firth arrived at the studio that morning expecting the usual warmth and pleasantries. He'd been on the show before. Everyone knew him as the gentleman of British cinema, the man who brought Mr. Darcy to life. The actor who won an Oscar playing a king who found his voice. He settled into the bright sofa, smiled at the cameras, and waited for Lorraine to begin. But something was different today. You could see it in her eyes. There was an edge there, something sharp and hungry. "Colin, lovely to have you here," Lorraine started, but her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Though I have to say, I'm surprised you had time for us little people today." Colin's smile faltered just slightly. "Sorry, what do you mean?" "Well, you know," Lorraine leaned forward, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Big Hollywood star like yourself. I heard you've been too busy for some of your old friends back home. Getting a bit too big for your boots, are we?" The audience shifted uncomfortably. This wasn't the Lorraine they knew. This wasn't how these interviews usually went. Colin straightened in his seat, trying to keep his composure. "I'm not sure where you've heard that, Lorraine. I've always made time for the people who matter to me." "Really?" Lorraine's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. "Because I've heard differently. I've heard you've become quite the diva on set. Demanding, difficult, not the charming Colin we all thought we knew." Colin's jaw tightened. "That's simply not true. I don't know who's been telling you these things, but they're wrong." "Are they, though?" Lorraine pressed on, clearly enjoying herself now. "Come on, Colin. You can be honest with us. You've changed, haven't you? All that success, all those awards, it changes people. Makes them forget where they came from." "I haven't forgotten anything," Colin said quietly, his voice firm but controlled. "And I don't appreciate what you're implying." But Lorraine wasn't done. She shuffled her notes dramatically like she had some damning evidence prepared. "I've got quotes here from people who've worked with you. Should I read them out? Because they paint quite a different picture from this humble act you're putting on." Colin took a deep breath. You could see him trying to remain professional, trying to give her the benefit of the doubt. "Lorraine, I came here to talk about my new film. If you have issues with me personally, perhaps we should discuss this off camera." "Oh, so now you want to hide?" Lorraine laughed, a harsh sound that echoed through the studio. "That's convenient. Come on a talk show, but don't want to talk? Typical." The crew members were looking at each other now, confused and uncomfortable. This wasn't in the script. Nobody knew what was happening or why Lorraine was acting this way. "I'm happy to talk," Colin replied, his patience clearly wearing thin. "But I'm not going to sit here and be accused of things that aren't true." "What's this really about?" Lorraine leaned back, crossing her arms. "It's about honesty, Colin. It's about accountability. You actors, you think you can just float through life playing pretend, getting paid millions, and never face any real questions." "Real questions?" Colin's voice rose slightly. "You haven't asked me a single real question. You've just been throwing accusations at me since I sat down." "Because somebody needs to," Lorraine shot back. "Everybody else treats you like royalty. Everyone else is too scared to ask the hard questions." "Well, not me. I'm not afraid of you or your publicist or your fancy friends." Colin shook his head slowly, a look of disbelief crossing his face. "This is unbelievable. I've never treated anyone like they should be afraid of me. That's absurd." "Is it?" Lorraine's voice turned cold. "Then why do your assistants quit? Why do directors complain about working with you? Why do other actors avoid your projects? None of that is true." Colin's composure finally cracked. "You're making things up. Where is this coming from?" Lorraine pulled out a piece of paper, waving it in the air. "I have sources, Colin. Very reliable sources. People who know you. People who've seen the real you when the cameras aren't rolling." "Then name them," Colin challenged. "Go ahead. If these sources are so reliable, tell me who they are." "I protect my sources," Lorraine said smugly. "That's called journalism." "That's called gossip," Colin corrected her. "And it's irresponsible. You can't just make accusations without proof." The audience was dead silent now. You could feel the tension radiating from the stage. This had stopped being an interview and turned into something else entirely. Something ugly. Lorraine's face hardened. "Oh, I have proof, Colin. Trust me. I wouldn't bring you on my show to embarrass you without proof." "Then show it," Colin demanded. "Show everyone this proof you claim to have." Lorraine hesitated for just a moment. And in that moment, everyone watching knew. She didn't have anything. This was all bluff and bluster. All smoke and no fire. I don't need to prove anything to you, Lorraine said defensively. My viewers trust me. They know I wouldn't lie to them. Colin stood up slowly, removing his microphone. His movements were deliberate, controlled. Your viewers deserve better than this. They deserve honesty, not whatever vendetta you're trying to play out here. Sit down, Lorraine ordered, her voice sharp. We're not finished. Yes, we are, Colin said calmly. I'm not going to participate in this charade anymore. You walk off this set and you'll regret it, Lorraine threatened. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of person you really are. Colin paused, looking directly at her. Do what you need to do, Lorraine. But I know who I am. And more importantly, the people who actually know me, who've actually worked with me, they know who I am. Your baseless accusations don't change that. You think you're better than me? Lorraine's voice was rising now, losing all pretense of professionalism. You think because you've won some awards, you can just dismiss me? I think, Colin said carefully, that you've forgotten what journalism is supposed to be. This isn't holding someone accountable. This is just cruelty for entertainment. Lorraine stood up too, facing him across the coffee table. Get out then. Go on. Run away like you always do when things get tough. I'm not running away, Colin replied, his voice steady despite the chaos. I'm walking away from something that isn't worth my time or energy. There's a difference. You're a coward, Lorraine shouted, her professionalism completely abandoned now. A pampered, privileged coward who can't handle a few tough questions. Colin shook his head sadly. If you truly believe that's what this was, then I feel sorry for you. I really do. He started walking toward the exit, his steps measured and dignified despite the madness swirling around him. Don't you dare walk away from me. Lorraine's voice followed him. I'm talking to you. Get back here. But Colin kept walking. The cameras followed him, capturing every moment of his departure. The crew stood frozen, unsure whether to stop filming or keep going. The audience sat in stunned silence, unable to process what they just witnessed. Fine, Lorraine yelled after him. Go ahead, but everyone's going to hear about this. Everyone's going to know what you did. Colin reached the edge of the set and turned back one final time. They'll know that I refused to be part of an ambush. They'll know that I stood up for myself when someone tried to tear me down for no reason, and I can live with that. You're finished, Lorraine screamed, her face red with rage. I'll make sure of it. You'll never work again. Colin didn't respond. He simply turned and walked through the door, leaving Lorraine standing alone on the set, breathing heavily. Her carefully constructed image shattered. The truth was, nobody knew exactly why Lorraine had targeted Colin that day. Some said she was having personal problems. Others whispered about pressure from producers to create dramatic moments, to boost ratings with conflict and confrontation. A few suggested she was jealous, envious of his success and respect in the industry. But whatever the reason, the result was clear. She had pushed too hard, gone too far, attacked someone who'd done nothing to deserve it. And in doing so, she'd revealed something about herself that couldn't be taken back. The interview had started as a standard morning chat, light, friendly, easy. But within minutes, it had descended into chaos. Lorraine had come out swinging with accusations that had no basis in reality. She'd attacked Colin's character, his professionalism, his relationships. She'd claimed to have evidence, but produced nothing. She'd tried to bully him into submission, to force him to defend himself against ghosts and shadows. And when Colin had finally had enough, when he decided that his dignity was worth more than playing along with her game, she'd exploded. All pretense had fallen away. The mask had slipped completely, revealing the ugliness underneath. The audience had watched it all unfold in real time. They'd seen Colin try to be reasonable, try to understand what was happening, try to keep things civil. They'd seen him give Lorraine multiple chances to back down, to change course, to return to normalcy. But she hadn't taken any of those chances. She doubled down instead, pushing harder and harder until the only option left was to leave. Throughout the entire ordeal, Colin had maintained his composure remarkably well. Yes, his frustration had shown through. Yes, his voice had risen at times. But he'd never stooped to her level. He'd never thrown insults back at her. He'd never tried to hurt her the way she'd been trying to hurt him. He'd simply defended himself, stated the truth. And when that wasn't enough, he'd removed himself from the situation. That was the moment that really mattered, that decision to walk away. Because staying would have meant continuing to participate in something toxic, something designed to humiliate him. And Colin had more respect for himself than that. He understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply refuse to play the game. Lorraine had clearly expected him to fight. She'd wanted him to get angry, to lash out, to give her the dramatic confrontation she was pushing for. But Colin hadn't given her that satisfaction. Instead, he'd stayed calm, stayed centered, and made a choice that preserved his integrity. The walk off the set had been remarkable in its simplicity. No grand gestures, no dramatic declarations. Just a man deciding that enough was enough and acting on that decision. The cameras had captured every step, every moment of that departure. And in those moments, Colin's character had shone through clearly. Even as Lorraine had screamed after him, even as she'd made threats and hurled accusations, Colin had remained dignified. His final words to her hadn't been angry or vengeful. They'd been almost sad, tinged with disappointment at what the conversation had become. The contrast between them couldn't have been clearer. Colin, calm and composed even in the face of baseless attacks. Lorraine, unraveling in real time, her anger and frustration boiling over in ways that shocked everyone watching. What made it all even more striking was how unnecessary it had been. Colin had come to the show in good faith. He'd been ready to talk about his work, to share stories with the audience, to be the gracious and engaging guest he'd always been. There had been no reason for any of this to happen. No inciting incident, no previous conflict, nothing that explained or justified Lorraine's behavior. That randomness made it even more unsettling. If she could turn on Colin like this, someone who'd always been professional and kind, then nobody was safe. Any guest could potentially become her target. Any interview could potentially devolve into an ambush. The audience could sense that. You could see it in their faces, in the way they looked at each other, in the uncomfortable shifting in their seats. This wasn't entertainment. This was watching someone abuse their power, using their platform to attack someone who couldn't fight back on equal terms. Because that was the real imbalance here. Lorraine had the home advantage. It was her show, her set, her crew, her audience. Colin was the guest, the outsider, the one without backup or support. In a fair fight, that wouldn't matter. But this wasn't a fair fight. This was an ambush, plain and simple. And yet, despite all those disadvantages, Colin had come out of it with his dignity intact. He'd handled an impossible situation with grace and strength. He'd refused to be drawn into the mud, refused to compromise his values, refused to become the villain she was trying to paint him at. The moment when he challenged her to name her sources had been particularly powerful, because in that moment, he'd called her bluff. He'd forced her to either put up or shut up, and she'd done neither. She'd retreated behind the shield of journalistic integrity, claiming she needed to protect her sources. But everyone watching knew the truth. There were no sources. There was no evidence. There was just malice wrapped up in fake concern. Colin had seen through it immediately. He'd recognized what was happening and had tried, at first, to give her an out. He'd suggested they discuss it off camera, giving her a chance to explain or back down without public embarrassment. But she hadn't taken it. She'd pressed forward instead, determined to have her confrontation, regardless of the cost. That determination had been her downfall. Because the harder she pushed, the clearer it became that this wasn't about truth or accountability or any of the noble reasons she claimed. This was personal. This was an attack. And once the audience realized that, once they understood what they were really watching, their sympathy shifted entirely to Colin. You could hear it in the silence. The lack of applause. The absence of support for Lorraine's questions. The audience wasn't on her side. They were uncomfortable, confused, disturbed by what they were seeing. They'd come for light morning entertainment and instead found themselves witnessing something much darker. Lorraine had misread the room completely. She thought she could carry the audience with her, that they'd enjoy seeing a celebrity taken down a peg or two. But she'd miscalculated. This wasn't taking down a celebrity. This was bullying a guest. And the audience knew the difference. When Colin had stood up to remove his microphone, there had been a collective intake of breath. Everyone knew what was coming. Everyone understood that this was the point of no return. And in that moment, there was probably a part of Lorraine that realized she'd made a terrible mistake. But pride wouldn't let her back down. Ego wouldn't let her admit she'd gone too far. So instead, she'd escalated. She'd ordered him to sit down, threatened him, tried to intimidate him into compliance. But Colin wasn't intimidated. He was disappointed. Yes, frustrated, certainly, but not intimidated. And that was something Lorraine couldn't handle. Her final threats, the screaming about ending his career, making sure he never worked again. All of that had rung hollow. Empty words from someone who'd lost control of the situation and was desperately trying to regain power. But power doesn't come from threats. It comes from respect. And in those final moments, Lorraine had lost any respect the audience might have had for her. The image of her standing alone on the set, shouting at a door that had already closed, was going to haunt her. It was the visual representation of her failure. She'd tried to create a moment of dramatic television, and had succeeded, but not in the way she'd intended. The drama wasn't in exposing Colin. It was in exposing herself. Because that's what had really happened here. All of Lorraine's accusations, all of her attacks, they hadn't told the audience anything about Colin. They already knew who he was. They'd watched his films, seen his interviews, heard stories about his kindness and professionalism from countless sources over the years. A few baseless claims from an angry host weren't going to change decades of evidence to the contrary. But those same accusations, that same anger, they'd told the audience plenty about Lorraine. They'd revealed a side of her that most had never seen before. The entitled host who believed her platform gave her the right to attack anyone she chose. The bully who thought she could hide cruelty behind the guise of tough journalism. The person who couldn't handle someone standing up to her, who lashed out when challenged. That was the real story here. Not Colin's supposed diva behavior, which didn't exist, but Lorraine's actual behavior, which everyone had witnessed firsthand. The silence after Colin left had been deafening. Nobody knew what to do. The show was supposed to continue, but how do you continue after something like that? How do you return to cooking segments and celebrity gossip after watching a guest get attacked and driven off the set? Lorraine had tried to compose herself, tried to laugh it off as if Colin was the one with the problem. But her hands were shaking. Her voice wasn't steady. The facade had cracked too deeply to be easily repaired. The crew had eventually cut to commercial, giving everyone a chance to breathe and process what had just happened. But the damage was done. The interview was over, not because the time had run out, but because one of the participants had been pushed beyond their limit. Colin's choice to walk away had been an act of self-preservation and self-respect. He'd recognized a no-win situation and had extracted himself from it with as much grace as possible. That took strength. That took clarity. That took knowing who you are and refusing to let anyone make you into something you're not. Throughout the entire confrontation, Colin had never claimed to be perfect. He'd never suggested he was above criticism or couldn't handle tough questions. What he'd objected to was the dishonesty, the baseless accusations, the manufactured outrage designed to create drama at his expense. That distinction mattered, because there's a difference between asking hard questions and launching personal attacks. There's a difference between holding someone accountable and trying to destroy them. Lorraine had crossed that line repeatedly, and Colin had been right to call her out on it. The fact that she'd had no response to his challenge about naming her sources spoke volumes. A real journalist with real sources would have been able to provide some kind of verification, some kind of evidence. But Lorraine had nothing, because there was nothing. She'd been making it up as she went along, hoping Colin would be too polite or too scared to push back. She'd underestimated him. She'd assumed he'd play along, that his British reserve and natural politeness would keep him in his seat no matter what she said. But Colin had proven he wasn't willing to sacrifice his integrity for the sake of appearances. When the choice came down to looking good or being true to himself, he'd chosen truth. That choice resonated with everyone watching. Because most people have been in situations where they've had to decide whether to stay and endure something awful, or leave. And face the consequences. It's never an easy decision. There's always pressure to just put up with it, to not make waves, to be the bigger person by absorbing someone else's cruelty. But Colin had shown another way. He demonstrated that walking away isn't weakness. It's not running or hiding or avoiding. It's setting a boundary and enforcing it. It's saying, this is where my tolerance ends. This is where I draw the line, and I won't let you cross it. Lorraine's response to that boundary had been telling. Rather than respecting it, rather than taking a moment to reflect on what she'd done to provoke such a reaction, she tried to punish him for it. She'd threatened his career, promised to ruin his reputation, done everything she could to make him regret standing up for himself. But those threats only reinforced that Colin had made the right decision. Because someone who responds to boundaries with threats and intimidation is exactly the kind of person you need to walk away from. They've shown you who they are, and you'd be wise to believe them. The saddest part of the whole ordeal was how avoidable it had been. At any point, Lorraine could have changed course. She could have acknowledged that her approach wasn't working, that she'd made Colin uncomfortable, that things had gone off the rails. She could have apologized, reset, started fresh with real questions about his actual work, but she'd chosen escalation instead. Every time Colin had pushed back, every time he'd questioned her methods or challenged her claims, she'd responded by attacking harder. She'd seen his resistance not as a signal to reconsider her approach, but as justification to intensify it. That pattern revealed everything because a good interviewer, a good journalist, knows when to adjust. They read their subject. They recognize when a line of questioning isn't productive, and they adapt. But Lorraine hadn't adapted. She'd simply battered away at the same points, the same accusations, growing more and more frustrated when Colin wouldn't give her the reaction she wanted. In the end, she'd created the exact opposite of what she'd intended. She'd wanted to expose Colin as difficult and entitled. Instead, she'd exposed herself as exactly those things. She'd wanted to create a viral moment of dramatic television. She'd succeeded, but the moment was about her failure, not Colin's. The truth was simple and undeniable. Colin had come to the show as a guest, willing to share his time and his stories with Lorraine's audience. He'd been cooperative and patient, even in the face of bizarre and hostile questioning. And when the situation became untenable, when it became clear that nothing he said would satisfy his interrogator, he'd made the mature and dignified choice to leave. That was the story. Not some manufactured scandal about Colin being a diva. Not some conspiracy about Hollywood stars thinking they're too good for morning television. Just a straightforward account of a guest being mistreated and deciding he deserved better. Everyone watching understood that. They'd seen it with their own eyes. They'd heard the accusations that came without evidence. They'd watched Colin try repeatedly to bring things back to a reasonable conversation. They'd witnessed Lorraine's refusal to meet him halfway. And they'd seen the inevitable conclusion when Colin finally said enough. There was something powerful about that moment when he'd paused at the edge of the set, turned back, and delivered his final statement. He could have just left in silence. He could have stormed off in anger. But instead, he'd taken a moment to articulate exactly what had happened and why he was leaving. That composure, that ability to remain clear and articulate even in the midst of chaos, that was the mark of someone who knew himself. Colin wasn't confused about what had just occurred. He wasn't questioning his decision or second-guessing his actions. He knew he was doing the right thing, and that certainty gave him strength. Lorraine's final screams had been the last gasp of someone who'd lost control completely. The professional host had disappeared entirely, replaced by someone who couldn't handle rejection or resistance. Her true self had emerged, and it wasn't pretty. The door closing behind Colin had been symbolic. It was the end of the interview, yes, but it was also the end of any pretense that what had just happened was normal or acceptable. Once that door closed, once Colin was gone, Lorraine was left alone with the consequences of her choices. And those consequences were written all over her face. The anger was still there, but beneath it, you could see the dawning realization that she'd made a terrible mistake. That this hadn't gone the way she'd planned. That the audience, her audience, had just watched her attack a beloved actor for no good reason. But there was no taking it back. No rewind button. No way to undo what had been done. The interview was over. Colin was gone. And the only thing left was the aftermath. That was where we leave this story. With Colin walking through that door, his dignity intact, his reputation enhanced by how he'd handled an impossible situation, and with Lorraine standing alone on her set, facing an audience that had just seen a side of her they'd never wanted to see. What had started as a routine interview had become something else entirely. A cautionary tale about the abuse of power, a reminder that platform doesn't equal permission, a demonstration that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is simply walk away. Colin had taught everyone watching a valuable lesson that day. He'd shown that you don't have to tolerate mistreatment, even from someone in a position of authority. That your self-respect is more important than any appearance or any show. That standing up for yourself isn't selfish or dramatic, it's necessary. And in the end, that was what people remembered. Not the accusations, not the drama, but the quiet strength of a man who knew his worth and refused to let anyone diminish it. That was the real story. That was what mattered. And that was why, 34 seconds into Lorraine's attack, everyone watching knew exactly who the real problem was.